Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium was created for people like us, you, me, autodidacts, people who are self-learners or self-teachers. They have a new plan, which is an annual plan. It's a subscription service. I remember back in the day when I had to purchase courses and they would ship me boxes of cassette tapes. And that's how long I've been with this company. They're great. But now you can just stream it all online. Of course, that's the way to go. It's a subscription service. You get an annual plan, $99 for your first year. That's 58% off the normal, right? And for that, you get access to all their premium, ad-free, unlimited content to learn from some of the world's brightest minds, including Wondrium's entire collection of videos. This is the great courses and other exclusive content. For example, you can learn about crypto, World War II, religion and philosophy, science and skepticism. I have 2 courses on there myself. Or even how to train your dog, and do photography, how to pick wine, all kinds of really interesting stuff. They have guidebooks and training guides to pair up with the programs. And you can take the app on the go, like I do on my phone. Here's one, for example, that I'm going to listen to this week. 12 Women Who Shaped America from 1619 to 1920. This is a subject I know very little about, so that's the kind of thing you can access through Wondrium. So check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free trial and then your 1-year subscription at 58% discount. So that's wondrium.com/Shermer to give it a try. All right. I hope you do. And here's our episode. Today's guest is the great David Chalmers. His new book, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. David Chalmers is University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. He's the author of The Conscious Mind, The Character of Consciousness, and Constructing the World. He is co-founder and past president of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, past president of the Australian Association of Philosophy, and president-elect of the American Philosophical Association, Eastern Division. He has given the John Locke Lectures and has been awarded the Jean Nicode Prize, and he's known for formulating the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which inspired Tom Stoppard's play The Hard Problem, and for the idea of the extended mind, which says that the tools we use can become parts of our minds. If you've ever seen the phrase "the hard problem of consciousness," I don't think you'll ever see it without the phrase attached to it as discovered by or invented by or affiliated with or created by or identified by David Chalmers. So he's a legend in this whole area of consciousness and the study of the mind and so forth. And his new book deals with virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and all the concomitant associated large philosophical issues with it, which includes like deep fakes. Are we closing in on something like artificial intelligence being able to create a virtual reality of somebody that we know who says something that they would never say, that kind of thing. There's a famous video of President Obama saying things he never said. We ask if virtual reality is an illusion or is it real? We talk a lot about Star Trek, like with Data on Star Trek, sentient, conscious. Does he have feelings? Does Watson know that he won Jeopardy? Does Deep Blue know that he beat the great Gary Kasparov in chess? No, it doesn't even know it's playing chess. Watson doesn't even know it's playing Jeopardy. But at some point, the machines will know what they're doing. They'll become self-aware. And so would that constitute sentience and therefore consciousness and therefore you're a personhood with legal status, rights, and so forth? We look at some of the big questions in philosophy through the context of virtual reality, which is what's involved in his book. Each of these has a chapter. How do the mind and body interact? What is consciousness? Does the mind extend beyond the body? What makes for a good life? What's the difference between right and wrong? How should a society be organized? And of course, my favorite question, is there a God? Well, if we achieve essentially the singularity in computing, then maybe there will be a God. Anyway, it was a pretty interesting conversation. We really do hit all the big topics. I think you'll really like this if you love science fiction. I mean, we talk a lot about Star Trek and all the other related science fiction stories and films and TV shows and so on that touches on these things. So before I hand you over to Dr. Chalmers, let me just make a note about supporting the podcast. We are entirely supported by you, the listeners, as well as the occasional ads from Wondrium, the great courses, which you'll hear. And but other than that, really, most of it comes from donations to the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. So your donations there are tax deductible. We don't want to put this behind a paywall because we're trying to reach as many people as possible. If you want to change the world, you got to reach a lot of people. It's just the way it is. That's our mission at Skeptics, is to promote science, rationality, reason, critical thinking, and all through these different platforms. So if you appreciate that, please go to skeptic.com/donate, and there you'll find you can give $5 a month, $50 a year, $100 a year, whatever you can give is very much appreciated. We do have a few big donors occasionally, but usually the vast majority of the support comes from small, regular donations from just regular people that feel that this is worth their time and money to support us. And we think it is. You know, the people act on their beliefs, and so it's important whether their beliefs are true or not. And that's what we do. All right. Thanks for listening. And here is David Chalmers. Hey, I loved your new book. It's called, I've already introduced it, but just to introduce it again, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. I listened to the whole thing on audio. It's a good read. I liked it because, first, there's a lot of pop culture.
You must have a long commute.
Well, I do a lot of cycling, a couple hours a day, and hiking with my dog. And yes, on Mondays, I drive from Santa Barbara all the way to Orange County to teach a class at Chapman University on Skepticism 101. And then I drive all the way back. And there's a few stops in between, so I can get through a book in a week easily, no problem.
Okay.
So
impressive.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, 500 pages, but yeah, long enough.
It's long. Yes, I would say that you accomplished your goal. That is to say, reaching a general public with super interesting questions and problems, while also addressing your colleagues. So someone like my friend Dan Dennett could read it and go, okay, I'm challenged by this. I got to think about this, and I'm going to be skeptical of this or that and push back or whatever you philosophers do. But in other words, it's a third culture book. It's for everybody. And I like those kind of books. Yeah. No, it's like the analogy I make is like Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, isn't the pop version of his technical papers. It's the only version there is. And you can read it as a professional scientist, or you can pick it up at the bookstall and a regular person on an airline reads it. So, yeah, same thing with yours book.
Yeah, I grew up on, Gödel Escher Bach by Doug Hofstadter, who went on to be my PhD advisor. So he's always been the model for me, just putting forward his ideas, and it works at every level.
Yeah, good. That's a good place to start. Give us a little bit of
whether AI, philosophy,
give
science.
Us some background of it. Who are you? Where were you born and raised? Where'd you go to school? How'd you get interested in consciousness and philosophy and all that?
Yeah, well, I was born in Australia, and I'm still Australian. Grew up in Sydney and then Adelaide. My teenage years, I guess, I was pretty much a science geek. Science, math, science, computer science, especially math. I did a whole lot of math stuff, math competitions, math Olympiads, the whole thing. And I went on to university to keep studying math, well, maths, as I called it then, the Australian way. And even went on to Oxford to get partway through a doctorate in mathematics. But somewhere along the way, I picked up the consciousness bug. Partly the philosophy bug, thinking about philosophy. I took one course in philosophy as an undergraduate, but at some point along the way, I became obsessed by the problem of consciousness. Where does consciousness fit into a physical world? How is it that physical processes in the brain could give you consciousness. This just seemed to me to be the most interesting and important unsolved problem in the world. And for a long time, I just kind of thought about it for fun. I didn't really think anyone would get paid for thinking about this stuff. It's just, I had a new theory of consciousness every week. But at a certain point, when I went to Oxford to keep studying math, this obsession just took over, and I thought, okay, this seems to be like what I want to be thinking about. I need to think about consciousness full time. How do I do that? And it seemed to me then like the best way to come to it was to move to philosophy, because philosophy allowed you to take the big picture approach to questions like consciousness, bringing in science, but bringing in every field where it's relevant and not necessarily being anchored to a bench, having to perform a bunch of pretty narrow experiments in order to get tenure. So actually, it was a long story, but I contacted Doug Hofstadter, whose books I'd read when a teenager, Gödel, Escher, Bach, and loved, and he said, "Why don't you come to Indiana University and work with me in a group he was just setting up then with a lot of people and from AI and psychology, and I guess I was the resident philosopher." So I went over there, joined Doug's research group, which is basically an AI lab, but had room for everything under the sun. Ended up doing a PhD in philosophy and cognitive science, thinking about the problem of consciousness, and ended up publishing that as my first book, The Conscious Mind, which is basically all about this problem. How on earth can you explain consciousness in physical terms, and actually arguing that there are limits to what you can explain in physical terms here, but we can have a science of consciousness all the same. That was just the mid-90s, when the science of consciousness was just getting off the ground. So it was a very, very exciting time around then.
Yeah, you've kind of famously become known as the hard problem of consciousness man. I don't think I've ever seen that phrase printed anywhere without your name in front of it. So that's kind of nice to have that instant quick read for who you are and what you do. Of course, there's much more to it than that. And I think the one time we met was at a TED conference where you and I were both speaking. And after you gave your speech about the hard problem of consciousness, and you were standing at a little table, round table, and I was standing there talking to you, and Dan Dennett walks up, and he gave you a really nice compliment, like, David, that was the best presentation of your theory of consciousness that I've ever heard. And you said, oh gosh, thanks, and he said, now I know exactly why you're wrong. I don't remember what he said, but I remember that as like, ooh, oh boy, okay, here we go. So
we go back a long, long way. In fact, Dan was very good buddies with my thesis advisor, Doug Hofstadter. They edited a book together, The Mind's Eye, way back in maybe 1981 or something. That was pretty influential for me. So I don't know. Dan and I are on opposite side of a lot of issues, but I cut him a lot of slack, having written that book and having done a lot of really good work. And we sailed for a week off the coast of Greenland about 5-6 years ago on like a consciousness cruise.
Consciousness cruise.
We enjoy talking about this.
This is not your new age consciousness cruise, I'm sure, where you're taking mind altering drugs along the way.
It was a Russian entrepreneur who was super into. He actually did a PhD on free will at Moscow State University. Really serious about the issues, and he became friends with Dan. They brought along a few of the Russian philosophers, and then 10 philosophers from around the world working on consciousness, with the idea that we'd explore Greenland in the mornings and explore consciousness, argue all the issues out with each other in the afternoons on the boat. And it was amazing. I think people can find the videos online. They look around.
Well, while we're on that, so as I understand it, the hard problem is that of consciousness is how do you explain the experience of consciousness, what it's like to be me or you or a bat or whatever. And the so-called easy problem would be what the neural correlates of where red is detected in the visual cortex or whatever. That's not easy as in scientifically easy, but it's easy conceptually. We can figure that out. But the harder problem is how you would go from neurons swapping chemicals to you and I having an experience of being what it's like to be something. Is that basically it?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. I mean, what I call the easy problems actually are problems tied to behavior, how it is we do certain things, how it is that we discriminate certain things in our environment, how it is our brain integrates information, how it is we act on information, how it is we can report it and say, I see red. those are all objective things that the brain does, and we can explain those things by giving some neural mechanism that performs that function. Yeah, the hard problem is explaining subjective experience. Why is there something it's like from the first-person point of view when you perceive an object, or when you feel pain, or when you think a thought? There's this subjective experiential quality to seeing a color or to feeling pain, and it's not obvious why that exists. Why don't all these processes in the brain go on, like detecting something red without it actually being subjectively experienced from the first person point of view? It is. I mean, that's a datum about our mental lives, that we have these experiences. But the hard problem is, why does consciousness exist at all? And more specifically, why does it take on the various forms that it does?
Let me read to you Steve Pinker's summary of the problem, and I tend to agree with his analysis here. This is from Enlightenment Now, and he's such a clear writer on this, and then you can kind of respond to this. So here's Pinker. In the end, I still think that the hard problem is a meaningful conceptual problem, but I agree with Dennett that it is not a meaningful scientific problem. No one will ever get a grant to study whether you are a zombie or whether the same Captain Kirk walks on the deck of the Enterprise and the surface of Zakdorn. And I agree with several other philosophers that it may be futile to hope for a solution at all, precisely because it is a conceptual problem, or more accurately, a problem with our concepts. As Thomas Nagel put it in his famous essay, What It's Like to Be a Bat, there may be, quote, facts which could not ever be represented or comprehended by human beings, even if the species lasted forever, simply because our structure does not permit us to operate with concepts of the requisite type, close quote. The philosopher Colin McGinn has run with this idea, arguing that there is a mismatch between our cognitive tools for explaining reality, namely chains of causes and effects, analyses into parts and their interactions, and modeling in mathematical equations, and the nature of the hard problem of consciousness, which is unintuitively holistic, close quote there. Our best science tells us that consciousness consists of a global workspace representing our current goals, memories, and surroundings, implemented in synchronized neural firing in frontoparietal circuitry. But the last dollop of the theory, that it subjectively feels like to be such circuitry, may have to be stipulated as a fact about reality where explanation stops. Close quote from Pinker there. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic with Pinker on the mystery, but I guess I'm more optimistic about the possibilities for an eventual science. I don't know. Maybe it's just I'm a glass half full guy here, whereas I don't know. Pinker's normally pretty optimistic, but not so in this context. I guess I think it's early days for the science of consciousness, and yeah, there is something here very, very deep that we don't understand. It may well be that we don't fully have the concepts for understanding the connection between brain and consciousness yet, but I think it's very early in the game. They'll probably, in 500 years' time, people will look back on where we were now and say, okay, well, they didn't know the first thing. So I do think right now, what is going on in this, there is a robust and active science of consciousness right now, but mostly it's not trying to solve the hard problem. What it is, as you say, trying to find correlations between bits of the brain and consciousness. And if you're very ambitious, try and find some general principles, like consciousness goes along with the global workspace, or consciousness goes along with integrated information. But the question of why consciousness exists at all is generally not addressed by these theories. And at this point, there's a couple of different approaches. One is to say, well, like Dan Dennett, that maybe there isn't anything else that you need to explain here, the hard problem of consciousness. All you got to do is explain those behaviors, and the rest of it is an illusion. The sense that there's something else that needs explaining is an illusion. That requires biting an awfully big bullet. So I say more power to Dan for going there. But I think most people find that implausible, just because consciousness seems to be a datum. Another approach, which I quite like, is doing what Pinker did there at the end, and say some things in the world are fundamental. Space and time and mass and charge and a bunch of standard scientific theories are taken as fundamental. Then there are some fundamental laws, like principles of relativity or quantum mechanics, ground unified theory. Why are the laws of quantum mechanics true? Well, something like that has to be taken as basic. Why is there space? Well, actually, there are theories now that try and explain why there is space. But say in classical Newtonian theory or relativity, you just take space as a basic ingredient of the universe. And I'm open to the idea of taking consciousness as a fundamental. But then the science will consist in trying to connect that fundamental consciousness to the rest of the world, to physical processes in the brain and maybe elsewhere. And the question is, once you've got the best possible theory of the correlations, physical processes of this form connect to consciousness of this form, is that a fundamental law? Or is there something further you can explain? Right now, I don't see how to go further, but it may well be that sometime in the future we'll have the insight that leads us to say this is why that law has to be this way. And maybe that could be a solution to the hard problem.
Right. I always like to say that the best argument for being cryonically frozen and brought back 500 years from now is just to find out how these things turned out. Like, oh, consciousness, we figured that out in the year 2225 when we found this little whatever, or dark matter turns out to be this and dark energy turns out to be that. Oh, that was a simple one as it turns out. Oh, okay.
Totally. I'm counting on the AI systems, the super intelligent AI systems of the future to be much better at doing science and philosophy than us. So they're going to solve all these problems for us. Maybe AI will solve the hard problems.
It might.
Us.
I mean, that's kind of part of your book is to talk about those kind of modeling of scientific problems using AI to solve those problems. But before we dive into that, I've been quoting you for years on this 2009 survey that you conducted with your colleagues, 3,226 philosophy professors and graduate students to weigh in on 30 different subjects of their concern in their field. And so I noticed in your new book, you said, I think you updated that in 2020, right? But the specific percentages are not going to be my point here, but things like external world, idealism, skepticism, or non-skeptical realism, 81% lean or accept non-skeptical realism. So there is a real world. Okay. Mind, physicalism, or
that was the closest we got. That one was the closest we got to a consensus on any questions.
Well, this is going to be my point.
Question in the survey. 81% said, yeah, there is an external world.
Most of them, you don't have much consensus, like mind, physicalism or non-physicalism. 56% versus 27% versus 16% other. Or, let's see, free will, compatibilism, libertarianism, or no free will. You got 59% on compatibilism, but 14% other, 13% libertarianism, 12% no free will. Well, my point is this: if, like when Einstein, it was presented with that book, 100 scientists against Einstein, and said, why 100? If I'm wrong, only one is needed. And so, why is it you guys have not come to some kind of consensus on most of these issues? It would be like if climate change was still debated and 50% said yes, 50% said no, or it was still unclear after 75 years or 50 years that the Big Bang theory and the steady state theory are still going back and forth, and scientists are conflicted about this. They just don't know. In science, we have a sense that there's some progress, and at some point we reach a consensus. So 97% of climate papers can accept that anthropogenic global warming is real. Okay, so we've kind of solved that problem. But after 2,500 years, if you guys are still unable to resolve the free will determinism problem, as one example, what does that mean about the problems themselves?
I think what's going on here is philosophy is almost by definition the too hard basket of problems that we haven't made enough progress on to get to the point of consensus yet. Many sciences started out as philosophy. Physics started out as philosophy. The study of space and time was the philosopher's domain. Isaac Newton considered himself a philosopher. But then he made enough progress on the problem to show how you could attack it experimentally, theoretically, formally, in such a way as to compel consensus on certain key points. And at that point, physics splits away from philosophy and becomes a science. This has happened again and again. Psychology split away from philosophy in the 19th century. Economics split away from philosophy, starting with Adam Smith. Bits and pieces of linguistics and logic and sociology are similar. So it's got to the point now when, all the things we've solved or have developed methods for arriving at a consensus on have turned into their own fields. And what's left in philosophy is the stuff we're still working on. So it's almost, if we had figured out free will, it'd be off there in science. But I think there are some problems which are right now kind of on that cusp where bits and pieces of them are being turned into science. And yeah, the problem of consciousness is one of them. Yeah, maybe the hard problem hasn't yet been turned into science, but many questions about key features of consciousness and how it connects to the brain and to action is gradually over the last 30 years turned into the kind of thing that you can do science with. So I see the problem of consciousness as one of those things that could potentially move across that border from no consensus and philosophy to something like at least consensus on methods and therefore science. But yeah, it's not there yet, and it's to be expected. There's going to be some problems like that. Those will be the ones we call philosophy.
Are there Mysterian mysteries that you think could never be answered, or is that too bold a statement at this point? Not just consciousness, but I don't know.
There are some tough ones. Why is there something instead of nothing? I don't know. How could we ever answer that one? That's very deep. What answer to that question could there possibly be? But I'm not imaginative enough. Problem of consciousness is a deep one. I used to think we could never solve the question, how can we know about the external world? This problem goes back to Descartes. It's like Descartes said, I know I exist. I think, therefore I am. But there was always this problem of how do we actually know anything about the external world? I used to think maybe we could, maybe it was going to be hard to make progress on that one. But actually, some of the stuff in this book made me think, okay, maybe it's possible to make more progress on that one than I thought. So I'm an optimist. I would like philosophical problems to be solved eventually, but it's not necessarily going to happen fast.
Yeah. Analogy I make when I talk about the paranormal and the supernatural is that there is no such thing. Those are just linguistic placeholders for mysteries we haven't figured out yet, and we're calling it paranormal. So if you take, in the example I use, you take something like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's theory of consciousness about the microtubules in the neurons and the quantum effects inside these microtubules. You know all about this. Now, I don't happen to think they're right, but
Sure.
But if it turned out that they're right and that people could actually read other people's minds through these kind of spooky action at a distance across these quantum fields or something like that, that wouldn't make, say, ESP paranormal. It would make it a branch of quantum neuroscience or whatever you want to call it, quantum consciousness. And I think that's the way of most of these kinds of mysteries. They just go away because we figured it out, and they're no longer a mystery. So we don't need words like paranormal or supernatural.
Yeah, the problem of life ultimately broke down into a bunch of really specific questions, reproduction and metabolism and adaptation and so on. Yeah, people say sometimes maybe the problem of consciousness will break down in that way too. But if you break it down into these things like discrimination, integration, action, report, I say great, but now that's more like, well, you've left out the key thing, which is consciousness. Now maybe consciousness could break down into like perceptual consciousness, perception, thought, feeling, and so on. But then you've just turned one hard problem into three hard problems. So I don't think that makes the problem go away. That said, divide and conquer is an important strategy. There's a book I read recently by the neuropsychologist Mark Solms, where he says actually emotion is the key to consciousness. It all comes from there. Once we explain feeling in the sense of emotion, that will explain everything. And well, I don't agree. I think perception and cognition pose separate problems, but the general approach of trying to break down the problem into many parts and work on them one at a time, I think it's a reasonable place to start.
That's an interesting example because I just had Leonard Mlodinow on the podcast. He's a physicist at Caltech. He famously co-authored books with Stephen Hawking. His new book is on emotions, and I don't know if you know that Len was a writer for Star Trek: The Next Generation for a couple seasons, and so I asked him, so was Data? Data famously always wanted to have emotions, and they were trying to figure out how to program emotions in, and Len said basically we had to treat him like, if we were writing the scripts, had to treat him like he's just a person, because if he was just an automaton, just a robot, just an AI, he wouldn't do anything. He would just sit there until you tell him to do something. Like you have to program in when Captain Picard walks on the bridge, you are to stand up and turn around and say, "Hi, Captain, what can I do for you?" or whatever, right? He wouldn't be motivated to do anything. Therefore, he can't really be sentient because he's not feeling. There's nothing what it feels like to be Data on Star Trek without the emotional part. And so he was kind of thinking of it that that's kind of a form of consciousness, and that you can't program it in. It has to be an emergent property from the bottom up of something. I think Len said something like, if the kind of programming that he used to do, if P then Q kind of logical programming, would never do it. But if you had like parallel processing computing from the bottom up, emotions and therefore sentience and consciousness may just emerge on its own.
Now, I thought I recalled that somewhere in the next generation, Data got an emotion chip.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Got to finally feel some emotion. So that's somewhat in tension with this idea of emotion as this thing, which is
right.
Just bottom up emergent process. No, you got an emotion chip that will do the whole thing.
Right.
But consciousness, I think, in general. But consciousness, I think Data seems to me like whether or not he feels emotion, he certainly seems to be conscious in the show. And actually, one key moment in my new book is taken from Star Trek: The Next Generation when Data is on trial. His creator, that company, they want to break him down for parts to study him. And Picard says, no, he's conscious, he's got rights, and they have a trial to determine whether he's actually conscious. This is what the measure of a man. And they say, well, clearly they break it down into 3 bits. They say, clearly Data is self-aware. He knows he's here. Clearly he's intelligent. And they say, but the third thing, consciousness. And actually, they never quite resolve that one. They say, well, what is he? If he is conscious in just the smallest degree, then what then? And then they take that, actually. It's inconclusive, but they take that as reason enough to say Data has rights. He's not to be broken down for parts. And they even go so far as to say that means the fundamental question is, does he have a soul? I'm not sure I think that's the right question, but well, Star Trek ultimately came down on the side, I think, of Data.
Right. A little bit like Bentham's comment about animal rights. It's not can they, what did he say? Not can they talk and can they reason, but can they feel? Can they suffer?
Can they suffer? Can they suffer? I don't know. I think this brings up, it's not like this book is entirely Star Trek examples, but this brings up another great Star Trek case, which is the Vulcan, who can talk and reason, but doesn't seem to feel very much. Now, Spock on Star Trek is not a perfect example of this because he has a human mother, right? And furthermore, the Vulcans go through Ponfar every few years, so they have intense emotions. But take a being like a Vulcan who can think and who can reason, but doesn't feel, doesn't suffer. An extreme case of a Vulcan. Bentham would then say, well, it doesn't matter how you treat them. Because he was saying, the reason why we should treat animals well is that they can suffer, not that they can talk and that they can reason. But in the book, I end up arguing against this. I say, okay, suffering is important, but it's not the only thing. It would not be okay just to wantonly kill a Vulcan because they have no emotions. And this view is quite popular, actually, that what matters for moral treatment is just what emotion, feeling, or sentience, having positive or negative valence states. But this view seems to me to have an unacceptable consequence, which is faced with a being with, very low affective range, say 0 affective range, but just thinking, talking, acting, deciding, then it would be okay to, kill them casually. And that seems monstrous to me. So I think Bentham didn't quite get it right. Suffering matters, but so does thinking and reasoning.
Mm-hmm. I think people colloquially or kind of intuitively think of emotions as different from reason, but really it's so we have rationality because we're goal-oriented beings that want to accomplish things, and reason is the tool to get there. But reason doesn't tell us what the goal should be. We need some feeling about what I want. What do I want? I want to date that person. I want to eat that food. I want to go to this gym. I want things. And I don't know how you'd program that into an AI, the wanting of things versus just how to get the things, which is just a tool.
I guess with AIs, very frequently we program them in with goals. We say this is their kind of fundamental goals, or you give them a utility function, some objective function that we're trying to maximize or minimize. And that's just kind of a basic thing in the AI system. And I guess evolution probably does something kind of similar. It builds in certain goals. But yes, some of our goals seem to be strongly tied to affect. I don't know, food and sex seem to have very strong affective component. I don't know that they all do necessarily. I mean, say somebody wants to do science, wants to understand the world. That could be tied to the positive affect of, hey, coming to understand things in the world. I once read a paper called Explanation as an Orgasm. The idea was that once you actually understand something scientifically, it's like, oh my God, your brain is flooded with these chemicals, and that feels so amazing. But I don't think it has to be that way. I think, you can just seriously minded find, say, doing science really important. And a Vulcan, say, could be out there doing science because that's really important to them, not because it feels a certain way, but just because it's an important goal. Or maybe, Kant's view of morality was that, not that it's grounded in affect, it's just that, you have an insight, well, this is the right thing to do, so you do it. You might do it. It might also feel good, but I don't think that desires have to be and goals have to be associated with positive affect here.
Right. Well, I'm also fond of asking, was Deep Blue excited and glad that it beat the great Garry Kasparov in chess? I mean, if I beat Garry Kasparov, I'd be ecstatic, right? Or does Watson know that it beat Ken Jennings in Jeopardy? I guess the answer is they don't even know they're playing chess or Jeopardy, right? They're just grinding through algorithms.
Yeah, it looks like no in both cases. These are both such specialized AI systems, specialized on the game they play. I don't know, as AI gets a bit closer to artificial general intelligence, some of these language models these days, like GPT-3, seem to be showing signs of potentially being good at a number of things. You can at least train it up. So first it plays a good game of chess, and then it says, hey, fantastic, I won. Take that. Maybe future iterations of these things could come closer to having all those different components of a normal mind. But yeah, to date, most of the AI systems we've had, it's way too narrow in scope to be capable of that kind of reflection. Yeah, and I don't think anyone would say that Deep Blue was actually conscious of anything.
Although you could program it to say, if you accomplish this goal and you win, then let out a cheer. You're like, yay! But that would just be programming it to do something. Again, back to your hard problem. How would you know if it was excited and it gave out all the cues that we expect? You still wouldn't know that inside it feels excited.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, of course, one thing you might do is just ask it. Do you actually feel anything on the inside? And if it's just pre-scripted to say, yeah, of course I am conscious, you jerk, then that's one thing. But if it actually comes up, the philosopher Susan Schneider has proposed this as an artificial consciousness test. You ask the AI systems a lot of questions about its consciousness. How do you experience things on the inside? Do you think that your color red is the same as my color red? Could you imagine them being swapped? Does knowing about all this circuitry, does that tell you what it's like to feel pain? And if the AI starts expressing, spontaneously intuitions about consciousness, man, I know I'm just a group of silicon circuits, but I feel like so much more. At that point, maybe that'll be some evidence that it's conscious. Again, as long as it wasn't just programmed in. If it was programmed in, or if it's just imitating what humans say, then this would probably count for a lot less.
Right. Well, this is how I solved the other mind's problem. I applied the Copernican principle that we're not special to myself. I'm not special. So if I see in your face and your actions the kinds of expressions that represent grief, say, and sorrow, and I know what that feels like, I think, well, what are the chances that I'm the only one who actually experiences that, and this guy over here, these are just fake symbols or signals? And no, the chances are pretty good he's feeling what I'm feeling, and that's what the test you just described. But we've evolved that kind of other mind. I can read other people's minds by the expressions on their faces and their tears or their body language, and think, wow, I know what that guy's feeling because I have felt that, and that's what I expressed. So it seems to me, I don't know if that's good enough to solve that problem, but that seems like a reasonable argument, and that you could then apply it to one of your AIs at some point.
Yeah, and then the question is, how far do you expand the circle? There have been all these moral circles gradually being expanded from, our family to our group to, our nationality, or something restricted to eventually to, all nationalities and all races of humans, now to animals, to AIs. But yeah, how far how far does it go? I mean, I think we're now willing to, most people seem to be willing to extend consciousness to many non-human animals, probably certainly most mammals, I think. But then AIs, but then, after the AI, and the question is, where does it stop, After all, you might say, well, if they're as smart as a human, then we'll extend consciousness to them. But, a lot of people think mice are conscious, or maybe even flies have some element of consciousness. They're not as smart as us. So if we come up with an AI system which is as complex as, say, a fly, we say that has some basic element of consciousness too. I'm inclined to say yes. I'm inclined to be liberal with describing consciousness. I think there could be Actually, I noticed there's been a big debate going on Twitter about whether large language models like GPT-3 might have some little element of consciousness. And yeah, I'm not unsympathetic with the idea they might have some small element. I think, a worm like C. elegans with 300 neurons could have some little element of consciousness. So if that, why not a large language model with 2 billion parameters?
Yeah, it's the problem of, Richard Dawkins called this the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, where you make everything black and white. In case of consciousness, you'll hear people say, when do the lights come on? It's like it's a switch, but it's not. It's a dimmer, right? You have a little bit more, a little bit more. And that's a better way to think about it.
But is it a dimmer that has a dimmer that has a 0 point? One of those little clicks when you get to zero.
Right.
Zero, you got none of it. Then you got a positive value, right. And that's still an important difference, the difference between 0 and positive.
Right. Yeah. So the central thesis of this book is virtual reality is genuine reality, or at least virtual realities are genuine realities. Virtual worlds need not be second-class realities. They can be first-class realities. We can break down this thesis into 3 parts, and I'll read these and then we'll pick it up from there. 1, virtual worlds are not illusions or fictions, or at least they need not be. What happens in VR really happens. The objects we interact with in VR are real. 2, life in virtual worlds can be as good in principle as life outside virtual worlds. You can lead a meaningful life in a virtual world. And 3, the world we're living in could be a virtual world. I'm not saying it is, but it's a possibility we can't rule out. So let's pick that up there. Is there some way we could test any of those hypotheses?
Well, they are philosophical theses. So, philosophical theses by their nature aren't exactly the same as scientific theses. Just take the last one, the idea that we might be in a virtual world already. This is a version of the famous simulation hypothesis that, we could be living in a computer simulation. Get away. I mean, the simulation hypothesis is unfalsifiable in the sense that you could never conclusively rule it out. You might think you got some evidence that rules out that you're in a computer simulation, but boy, in principle, it looks like that evidence could have been simulated. If the perfect simulation is indistinguishable from ordinary physical reality, then you'll never get evidence that completely rules that out. On the other hand, we could at the very least get evidence for and against certain imperfect simulation hypotheses. Maybe the simulators are cutting some corners. They got some approximations in the laws of physics. So we could run people have proposed a couple of potential experiments you could do to find out if there are certain patterns in the background radiation that suggest that there are some approximations here. So there are some parts of the simulation hypothesis that you could test scientifically. But I'd say when it comes to this perfect simulation hypothesis, almost by definition, you could never falsify it. I think that might mean that it's not a scientific hypothesis, but that doesn't mean it's still not perfectly coherent, meaningful philosophical hypothesis. And one way I like to make the point that it's still a perfectly meaningful hypothesis is the same principle. We could construct a simulation like this ourselves. Via simulation technology is getting better and better. Will ultimately be able to construct perfect simulations of universes and hook beings up to them. We'll have experiences as of being in those universes, even though they're not. Maybe in 100 years we'll be able to do that to other people, put them in perfect simulations. So then we can just raise the question, could that be happening to me? And that just seems obviously to me a meaningful question, expresses a coherent hypothesis about reality, whether or not we can test it scientifically.
I know a good test. Let's say you and I were in the room together, and all of a sudden you started buffering and you froze for a minute. or I was speaking but you couldn't hear me because there was some break in the system. That would be a clue. Like, hey,
the simulators are trying to give us a clue here. Yeah, there's been some glitching. They're sending us a signal.
Yes. Yeah, there was another one of my
it's
favorite.
It's like the black cat that crosses your path twice.
Right, from the Matrix. That was the Matrix, right?
In the Matrix,
yeah. I love that movie. And one of my other favorite Star Trek Next Generation episodes, and I promise listeners that David has dozens of other sci-fi examples besides Star Trek in the book. But this was
we got Black Mirror, we got Rick and Morty. We're not just
Black Mirror
in the 1960s or the 1990s.
Black Mirror really pushed the envelope. I thought that was a stunning series. Anyway, this episode
Black Mirror has had a number of fantastic simulation episodes.
Totally. Yeah. Anyway, this is the episode called "Ship in a Bottle," where they go on the holodeck and Data, or whoever, calls up Sherlock Holmes' arch nemesis Moriarty. And then at some point, if I recall, Moriarty leaves the holodeck and he's out walking around in the Enterprise itself. And the Picard is saying, that's not possible. I think it began with a glitch, like Data was all of a sudden left-handed rather than right-handed or something like that. And that was a clue, like, hey, there's something weird here with the programming. Then all of a sudden Moriarty's out on the actual ship and he talks Captain Picard into giving him the secret code for destroying the ship or something, because he's going to do it if he doesn't get the code. Then he takes over the Enterprise because he wants to travel around the cosmos with his sweetheart. And then all of a sudden at the end, they realize that he never left the holodeck, that this entire thing is a virtual simulation, including the holodeck inside the holodeck of the Enterprise and so on. Mm-hmm. And then the whole thing ends with I forget who's holding up the little cube, but that Moriarty and his sweetheart are forever galloping around the galaxy in this little cube. In the Enterprise, it's in the cube, and then maybe this is what we are. We're just in a cube somewhere on somebody's desk.
I remember at the end too. Yeah, the people on the Enterprise, they say, "Damn, maybe this is happening one level higher. This is happening to us." And then they press the button like end simulation, and they say, "Oh, phew, nothing happened." But come on, you wouldn't expect that to happen within the simulation. Okay, yeah, right. Within the simulation, nothing happened, but you do not have access to the end simulation button for this simulation. That's just whoever's running the holodeck in the next universe up.
Right. So
that, you find that idea. Actually, I found the first occurrence of that idea in a science fiction novel around in a science fiction story around 1960. Kind of an obscure one where I can't even remember who the author was now, but where a couple of characters go into the future and start exploring some simulations, and then they come back and they say, "Couldn't this be happening to us? How could we ever know?" And the answer immediately hit them: we could never know. There's philosophy right there in a science fiction story. It's Descartes, basically. How do we know this is the bottom level of reality? Maybe we can never know.
Right. You open with that story of the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, I think it's pronounced, of him dreaming of
Zhuangzi is
Yeah, so he dreams of being a butterfly, but then he later wonders, I wonder if I'm a butterfly dreaming I'm a human now. But that's a good example of dreams. I mean, when you first wake up, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that and that happened. And then a few seconds go by, maybe a few minutes, and you're like, oh, right, that was just a dream, because it fades. It's blurry. It's not very granulated, and it's like, no, okay, that didn't actually happen. But this reality, it doesn't disappear. It doesn't go away after a few seconds or minutes. So wouldn't that be the difference between reality and a dream, that at some point the reality sticks around and the dreams fade?
Yeah, that is one very big difference, that realities are stable, whereas dreams are not. Although maybe you could have a very stable dream. And I guess Inception, the movie, illustrates this to they got some pretty stable dream realities, although not that stable. They still tend to wobble and crash when someone starts to wake up, and you've got that spinning top at the end of Inception. That's a bit like the holodeck thing. If it spins too long, maybe you're still dreaming. But I guess the other difference, though, is dreams. Even if you had a very stable dream, a dream is still a product of your own mind. It's you that's dreaming it up. And in that sense, whereas a simulation, computer simulation, is something outside of you. And I think that's one of our key criteria for reality. We want it to be an external world, something outside of us that we're interacting with, not just a part of our own minds. So this, I think, is one reason why even a very stable dream, it's kind of a computer simulation. It's kind of a simulation, but it's a simulation created by you. Whereas, the regular simulation hypothesis is a simulation created by somebody else and somehow involving interaction with something outside of you. Maybe gives an extra element of reality to the simulation idea that's not present in a dream.
Yeah, it's like this idea of the brain in a vat, and somebody's stimulating the brain through various avenues that makes it think it's physical and out in the world or whatever. But in a way, that's what we are. We're brains in a skull, and our brains have no direct contact with the world. I don't really see a pen. I see photons of light bouncing off this and refracted through my lens and transduced into neurochemical transmitter substances that fire the neurons and go back to the visual cortex, blah, blah, blah. And, okay, so in a way, we are living in a VR, a brain in a vat kind of scenario.
Yeah, though I guess with ordinary perception, there's a mix of top-down elements like our internal models and the autonomous simulations we construct with bottom-up elements. I mean, we are actually getting inputs from the outside in perception. If different things were being input, then we'd experience different things. So this is a bit different from the dream case. The dream case, there's no input. You basically make up the simulation. You wander around in the simulated world. Whereas in perception, at least there's inputs coming from the external world that we've got to accommodate. But on the other hand, it's true, we accommodate that with our Bayesian prior probabilities and our existing models of the world. And what we actually end up experiencing is a big mix of the evidence of those inputs coming in, and the top-down models end up constructing our reality. I'd say that's a bit better than the brain in a vat case. But maybe it's a brain in a vat with that's got some input sensors as well on the attached to its perceptual organs. Actually, in the book, I've got a picture of Descartes' evil demon doing its work on a brain in a vat. But to get lazy, it just says, let me just do all this with a computer. Instead of the evil demon having to come up with all the sensations directly, it says, okay, let me just run a computer simulation and feed that to the brain in a vat. And that way we can mash them all up: the evil demon, the brain in a vat, and the computer simulation.
Have you calculated what kind of computer processing you would need to simulate another person, say, a person having a full experience of interacting with others in a physical environment? I remember Frank Tipler had this calculation in his Physics of Immortality book, where he made this argument in the far future of the universe, there'll be computers along the lines of what you're arguing, so powerful they'll be able to recreate everyone who ever lived, including you. And it doesn't matter if there's people who are reconstructed who never lived. It doesn't matter. You only have to know that it's you that's been resurrected. And he came up with a number, 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 186. The binary digits you would need to basically reconstruct the entire universe. So along those lines, how long would it take to get there? Moore's law, doubling computing power and so on. How many decades, centuries, millennia before you could actually have what you're describing as a virtual reality so good you wouldn't be able to tell the difference? Did you just write down the actual number for me?
Yeah, I did some research on this. Yeah, I did a bit of research on this in the book. There's a bunch of people working on, for a start, how much computer power would it take to simulate a human brain in full detail, like every neuron and so on. People say, okay, you got roughly 100 billion neurons, roughly 1,000 connections each, and on current estimates, it looks like the brain performs the equivalent of about 10 to the 16 floating point operations per second. So that's 10 petaflops. People are having arguments about this. Some people say it's 10 petaflops. Some people say it's 100 petaflops. Okay, this is just one brain. You might want to have to simulate the whole world around them, and I don't know. Now it's going to depend on how much depth you're going to simulate the the environment in. But then, so we get to some number of petaflops or whatever comes next. But then, on the other hand, we've got computer power. We hope speeding up by say a factor of 10 every decade by Moore's law and the equivalents. Now, maybe that won't keep happening, but if that keeps happening, maybe we can get a factor of 10 to the 10 over a century. Kind of, to me and to various other people, suggest that possibly within a century or two, we've already got technology where, 10 petaflops is around, I think, the level of our best computers right now. So we've already got technology which could, in principle, simulate a single human brain at roughly ordinary speed, if only we knew the algorithms, if only we knew the right algorithms to run to simulate a brain. And if you want to simulate like 1,000 brains, then okay, well, just take 1,000 of those computers. I'll take 1,000 times as long, or wait a while for the technology to speed up. If you want to simulate the whole universe, well, of course, that's going to be extremely non-trivial. If the universe is finite, it cannot simulate itself unless it had a very pathological structure. But then, of course, a complex universe can simulate a simpler universe. So maybe we could simulate just the solar system, or maybe the universe simulating us is something different from us entirely. Likewise, we could simulate entirely different worlds. But yeah, I don't know how much it would take to simulate 7 billion brains and all of the processes that go along with them. But if Moore's law continues, I think people have calculated that the processing capacity of the universe is something like 10 to the 50 flops at least. So that's room to do an awful lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll say, well, if I recall, Frank's Tipler's definition of God was really this omega point. It was this far future giant computer that knows everything. It's your evil demon, but on the good side, I guess, and resurrects everyone who ever could have lived, and so forth. So that's I ran into a little bit of this when I was researching my book Heavens on Earth on scientific attempts to live forever. These are the mind uploaders. I know you're quite familiar with this argument. So you've like we have the genome, so we have the connectome. We're going to scan every single synaptic connection in your brain, and we know memories are relatively permanently stored because you can chill a brain down to near freezing during one of these massive surgeries, and when you warm the brain back up, the memories are still there. So they're not just a process; they're actually stored in there molecularly. This is the argument they make, in that so we could take a snapshot of you. So if we have your connectome, we have you, and you upload it to the cloud. Okay. So my problem with that was that assumes I am, the self, myself is defined as that moment in time when there's a snapshot taken of my brain, rather than, so that's the memory self, that's me, all my memories that are all stored in there, versus the point of view self. That is, from moment to moment, I'm looking out through my eyeballs, experiencing the world from one moment to the next. And no simulation could, no scanning of a connectome could ever capture that, in the sense that if we did this, like while I was still alive, let's say we slid you into a sophisticated MRI and scanned your brain and got your connectome and uploaded it to the cloud and turned it on, and David Chalmers is up there going, hey, or you're right here looking out, and you're still sitting there in your office going, no, I'm right here. This is me. That other is a copy. And of course, presumably, I guess the copy would go, no, I'm the actual David Chalmers. So now what have we got? 2 real, actual David Chalmers. Or if we made 10 copies, it'd be 10 of you. How do you think about that problem?
Yeah, well, this is such a classic. I mean, we seem to be stuck on Star Trek scenarios today. But yeah, I was worried about the teleporter in Star Trek, which basically seems to destroy you at one end and recreate a new copy at the other end. Does Captain Kirk get killed twice every episode, and a whole new Captain Kirk comes into existence. I mean, what if they didn't destroy you at one end? They created the copy down on the planet. Then I'd say, well, here I am. I'm the original. That's the copy, and exactly that issue arises for uploading. If we keep the original and make an uploaded backup or an uploaded copy, everyone's going to say, well, I guess the one in the biological body looks like they're the original. If you destroy the original and then have a copy, some people might then say, okay, well, I guess I guess that's you. But some people might say, "Oh no, you killed the original," and now we've got a copy. In my view, the only safe way, or at least the safest way, to do uploading is to do it gradually. I think I already mentioned the idea of replacing the neurons one at a time by silicon chips, or replace one small bit of the brain first, then another bit, then another bit, then another bit. And so there's only ever one of you there. Maybe you can be conscious throughout. So, yep, here I am, here I am, here I am. And the 5% of your brain is silicon, then 10%, then 20%, then 50%, then 100%. In that case, if I went through that, I mean, I don't know. Personal identity is still a very big mystery, so is consciousness. But if I went through that, I'd be fairly confident it would be me who came out the other side. But yeah, if you just replicate me all at once, I think all bets are off.
Right. Maybe there'd just be a new definition of self. Well, there's two of you, or there can be more than one of you. Although the moment you started to live a different life, even slightly different, you're going to have a different life experience from that point, and therefore you're going to diverge and be slightly different, and so that would make you two of you.
That's true. Even the twins, you've got you create two copies. For a moment, they're exactly the same, but then they're going to diverge, and they're very clearly going to be two different people. Of course, the same thing may be going on with each of us every moment if you buy into the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Each of us may be constantly forking into ever more individuals. So this is happening to us constantly. Which one is me, the original? I don't know. Maybe they all are.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yes. Okay. So what's the best arguments for the simulation hypothesis, that we are living in a simulation more likely than not, in a Bayesian kind of calculation?
I think the argument I take most seriously is a statistical argument that goes back to Nick Bostrom and Hans Moravec. But basically, the key idea is that simulation technology is potentially going to be very common. And there may well be many simulations created in the history of the universe. I mean, we've got pretty good reason to think that any sufficiently advanced civilization will be able to make simulations. And they'll probably also have some good motivation to make simulations. So unless there's some good reason not to, then they'll probably create many simulations. And then you start thinking, okay, so in principle, there could be 1,000 simulated universes for every unsimulated universe, or 1,000 simulated beings for every unsimulated being. And then you say, what are the odds that I'm one of the unsimulated ones? Well, if you follow the reasoning through, you might think, oh, 1 in 1,000. Now, I don't know. This argument has various assumptions, and there's some ways it could go wrong. It does assume, for example, that simulated beings will be conscious. If we're not conscious, if simulated beings aren't conscious, then I can know I'm not in a simulation from the very fact that I'm conscious. The argument also assumes that, we'll live long enough to be able to have this technology and that we'll choose to use it. There's various ways it can go wrong. And so for that reason, I would not put the probability we're in a simulation at 999 and 1,000. But at least in thinking it through for the purposes of the book, I came to be convinced that there's probably at least 50-50 that simulated beings can be conscious. And it's probably at least 50-50 that enough intelligent civilizations will survive and produce many simulated universes in turn. So multiplying that through, that got me 25% for there actually being way more simulated beings in the universe than unsimulated beings, which then puts me, perhaps being consistent, well, I guess it's about 25% that I'm in a simulation. Okay, which is not probably, but not too far off. It's at least reason to take it seriously. Now, no one should take those numbers too seriously. That was back of the envelope stuff, but it does suggest, a line of reasoning that can lead you to take the hypothesis seriously.
Didn't Bostrom come up with the actual number, like 51% more likely we are than are not, or something like that?
Don't think I've seen a specific number, but what he does have is a formula where it's like you've got 3 fractions, you multiply them together, and they've got to come out to pretty close to 0. So at least one of them has to be really small. The number of beings that survive, or the number of simulations they create, or something. Basically, one of those, or the fraction of beings which is simulated, which is unsimulated. One of those has to be super small. And then so he basically presents it as a 3-way conclusion. either we're properly simulated, or beings, societies like this will go extinct before they can create simulations, or they will choose not to create simulations. Those are his three conclusions. Well, my analysis, I think there's a few more possibilities to consider that he doesn't consider, but I'm pretty sympathetic with the spirit of the argument.
Reminds me a little bit of the Fermi paradox. Where is everybody? The argument being, apply the Copernican principle. We're not special, so we're likely in the middle of the bell curve of civilizations that develop out of a long evolutionary and cultural process. So somebody should have been, half of them would have been ahead of us. And if they're ahead of us on an evolutionary time scale by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years, look how much technology we've developed in the last century. They'd be, a million years ahead of us technologically. They'd have developed interstellar space flight or self-replicating robots that explore the galaxy, and you do the calculation, and it's like in 10 million years, you could colonize the entire Milky Way galaxy. Okay, where is everybody? Because we don't see them, right? It's a little bit like that argument. But what if we're first?
Yeah.
Somebody has to be first.
Yeah, we could have just got really lucky. Yeah, someone's got to first. We could just be super lucky and be the ones that are first. Yeah, we could just be super lucky and be the ones which are unsimulated. But you might think it's kind of improbable either way. It requires us to be very lucky. If on Bayesian grounds you think you should tend to favor hypotheses that makes your evidence to be the expected evidence rather than evidence you'd be very lucky to get. You might think at the very least on Bayesian grounds, we need to decrease our probability that there are a lot of other civilizations out there, and maybe even decrease our, what does it mean for the simulation case? Make it so we're not lucky. Well, I think, Bostrom says maybe we've got to decrease the probability that these other simulated civilizations will exist. That's one of his alternatives. Is maybe we'll actually end up, every civilization will end up destroying itself, and that's why the same thing that explains why we haven't seen all that galactic colonization explains why there aren't all these other why we're not simulated, because civilizations destroy themselves before they get to that point. Yeah, that's a pessimistic way of looking at both the Fermi paradox and the simulation argument.
Right. Or the other thing is that maybe they don't explore the galaxy physically. They create simulations and explore it digitally in their giant computers, and so we just don't see them here.
Yeah, well, you might have thought there was still some value to getting out there and exploring the physical universe. Even if it was just nostalgia, that was the universe we grew up in. So I don't know. Maybe they've got invisible technology. I suppose all those hypotheses get explored left and right in the Fermi paradox literature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, when you say something is real inside a virtual reality, and therefore other people are real, and therefore they're moral beings, and therefore our moral behavior matters, and from there you go and deal with all the great issues in philosophy. But what do you mean when you say something in virtual reality is real?
Yeah, well, I mean, this word "real" doesn't have any single set meaning. So in the book, I think I distinguished like 5 different meanings for the word "real," which maybe the 3 most are important are: something is real if it makes a difference, if it can actually affect things in the world, if it's got causal powers, philosophers say. Something is real if it's outside your mind. We talked about this before. Dreams are wholly inside your mind, so we don't really treat them as an external reality. And something is real if it's not an illusion. If it seems to you there's a pink elephant in front of you, but it's not there, then that's an illusion. We say the pink elephant isn't real. And I try to argue that virtual reality can be real in all those senses. Just say we're in a computer simulation, for example. Then, the dogs and cats and plants and trees I'm interacting with, I think they have causal powers. They can affect each other. They can affect me. They exist outside my mind. Even in an ordinary virtual reality headset, the virtual objects I interact with exist outside my mind. I can take off the headset, come back. They've been there the whole time. And I don't think it has to be an illusion. I think, even if we're in this simulation scenario, I think there really are dogs and cats and people out there. They're made of bits. They're digital creatures if we're in a simulation. So they're different from non-digital creatures. But I still think they're perfectly real. And just because you're digital just because these things are made of computer processes, it doesn't follow that they're not real. They're perfectly real entities, but they're at some level made of digital processes. It's a bit like what John Wheeler called the it from bit hypothesis about physics. That underneath the level of, just as there are atoms and molecules underneath cells, which are underneath organisms, and there are particles, quarks, electrons underneath atoms, underneath all that is a level of bits. And this is sometimes called the it from bit hypothesis about physics. But just because, so if we're in a simulation, something like the it from bit hypothesis could be true, but it doesn't mean that none of this stuff is real. It's just made of bits.
So when you hear something like the universe is mathematical, Max Tegmark, talks about that. He wrote a book about this, and never sure I grasp what that means. It's mathematical. You mean in a Platonic sense, these ideas exist separate from minds?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Max's version does seem kind of Platonic. It's just like all you need is pure mathematics, really. All you need is the existence of certain mathematical entities in mathematics, and that's enough to make all this real. I guess I don't know. I guess I think that mathematics has to be made concrete somehow. It's not just mathematics existing as an abstract object. In that sense, every universe exists. But I think we live in a very particular world where, some scientific theories are true and some are false. One problem for Max's view is that every scientific theory is true in some world. So if I talk about Newton's physics, you might think that's been falsified, but it looks like, it's true somewhere in mathematical heaven. So what really matters is what's true in this world. And I think, that's the concrete world around us. I think the concrete world around us can be described by mathematics, but it's not pure mathematics. I mean, it's applied mathematics at the very least. There actually exist some entities which are described by this mathematics, whether this is particles or a wave function and so on here. The mathematics here is actually correctly describing reality, and the world does seem to be amazingly apt for mathematical description. That was what Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. But I'd say that nonetheless, the world has to have there's actually a very nice result by the mathematician Max Newman that suggests the world has to have a nature that goes beyond mathematics. Because if you just specify a mathematical structure, you can find that in any world whatsoever. It's basically trivial. You can describe any reality with a given mathematical structure. I think just as long as it has the right size, the right number of objects. So we need some non-mathematical structure in reality as well. And in the book, I argue that what we actually need is the right structure of cause and effect among things. In the basic laws of physics, there's this structure of cause and effect, or actually happening by law between things. And I argue goes just a little bit, just enough beyond mathematics that it requires some concrete existence and gives us some structure in the world which is not mathematical. But then, I think one key idea, though, is when it comes to, say, thinking about simulations as reality, a simulation of a universe, it duplicates the mathematical structure of the universe it's simulating. If it's a good enough simulation, all that mathematical structure will be present in the simulation. And second, all the cause-effect structure in the universe you're simulating can also be present in the simulation. I guess what computer simulations do, they get little bits of cause and effect inside the computer that mirror cause and effect out there in the world. If that's right, then I think what a computer simulation could do is kind of take both the mathematical and the cause-effect structure of a universe and bottle it inside a computer, which by my light is enough to give it a kind of reality. So that's one way that's where I end up ultimately justifying this thesis that simulations are a genuine form of reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with virtual reality, but I was at a conference a few years ago. It was one of these TED-like conferences. I don't think it was TED, though, where they had this virtual reality helmet goggles thing. And the people that were doing this, it was just out in the exhibit area, so people were lined up to do it. And so I got in line. What's this all about? And there was like a board that was maybe 6 feet long and about that wide, maybe 1.5 feet wide. And you had to walk out on the board. And in the virtual reality, you are on a plank, like at the top of the Empire State Building, looking down. And they described this to me, and I thought, oh, come on, your foot is like that far off the carpet. I mean, I'm not going to be fooled by this. And people were unable to get to the end of the board. That was what was funny, and everybody's laughing. And I'm thinking, there's no way I'm not going to get to the end of that board. So I put it on, I start to walk out, and I just couldn't do it. Even like when I tried to kind of move my foot off the board a little bit to feel the carpet, to remind myself the visual was so good. Just triggered everything in my body to stop, don't move. That felt pretty real.
Yeah, I've been there. I've had that experience. I've got my here's my Oculus Quest 2 headset. Which is
wow.
Same kind of thing, I guess you were using then.
Right.
And I can go in here. There's actually an app in here somewhere called Richie's Plank Experience. And you can go out there and you can walk on a plank, and then you can do all kinds of scary stuff. You can step off the plank if you're brave enough. I eventually stepped off the plank.
You did?
Like, first you're terrified, and then he's like, oh my God, I'm walking on air. Then the weird thing is eventually you get used to it. You just realize, okay, I'm in a world that has some weird invisible force field just beneath the plank, and you get used to the idea that you can walk on this invisible force field.
Oh my God, I should have kept going.
Yeah. And you get used to it. You can walk through other people. And at first, that feels weirdly intimate, Oh my God, what's happening here? Then you just get used to it. People can walk through other people. So you get used to these different ways, the affordances that each of these virtual worlds have. And yeah, you just get used to walking on air when you need to. But the very first time I did it, it was like, I remember that feeling. I wanted to tap my foot, reach my foot off the plank and tap that floor to make damn sure it was there before I stepped off, even though I knew perfectly well it was there.
Yeah. Oh, that's wild. Yes. Well, you start your book talking about Pong and Pac-Man and the old technology, and now this example of the plank is so much more developed. And so you just take Moore's law out, and at some point we're going to have the Planck example cubed, whatever, 1,000, or 10 orders of magnitude more sophisticated than that. And so where are we, since you had a discussion of deep fakes, I'm curious about this. You talk about things in virtual reality are real, but, a celebrity or, Obama is made to say something he never said, and, it sure sounds like him and looks like him. But of course he would say, that's not me, that's a deep fake. So how do you think about, the deep fakes as kind of that transition to this virtual reality we're heading for? And what are the moral consequences of that?
Yeah, when it comes to actually existing virtual reality technology and the stuff which is coming, there's a number of chapters in the book on this and where it's going and so on. I think where I argue that if we're in the simulation, all this stuff is real. I had this reality checklist of 5 notions of reality. I said 5 out of 5 if we're in a simulation. For the kind of thing you experience through a virtual reality headset now, I say in principle that can be 4 out of 5. It's got causal powers. It's independent of us. It needn't be an illusion. But there's one other test, which is what I call the real X test. Like, is a virtual Obama in VR? Is it the real Obama? And I think we'd say, no, it's a different person. Is a virtual kitten a real kitten? I think we'd say, no, it's a digital kitten. It may in principle be just as complex and maybe eventually just as good, but even then it won't be a real kitten. So, okay, it's not the real Obama. It's not the real kitten. And I do think that with deepfakes, this is going to eventually have the capacity. I mean, right now, deepfakes are not that impressive, but they're getting better. I actually, in the book, I've got somebody ran a deepfake interview with me with GPT-3, one of these large language models. They trained it on a bunch of my writing, and then they did an interview with me. And I don't know, I didn't think it was very convincing. But a bunch of people read it. They said, hey, that sounds just like you. So they had deepfake David Chalmers. And that was just text. But yeah, but people are now working on deepfake images, of course, and deepfake videos. And before too long, maybe they're going to be able to combine that whole GPT-3 thing with deepfake video of me. And who's to say that, this, in a couple of years' time, I might be able to send my deepfake to have a conversation with you. And while the original stays home and, I don't know, does some philosophy or reads a novel or something. At that point,
if my digital self kicks the digital cat and it screams in agony, that would feel morally wrong. Like, you shouldn't do that, and yet it never happened.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I think it's not. Yeah, no, I think what happens in VR really happens, even with a deep fake. I think Yeah, virtual creatures are not the same as physical creatures. The virtual Obama is not a real Obama. The virtual kitten is not a real kitten. I mean, right now, of course, there are. If you have a duplicate of Obama inside VR, no one's going to say it's conscious. It's probably just going to be it's going to be a very simple simulation, non-player character style. But if we go towards a future when we actually have full-scale simulations of a kitten or of Obama inside VR, I would then say those deepfakes could themselves be conscious. So eventually we'll be able to make a deepfake Obama, a deepfake kitten, and maybe even these will be conscious. I mean, it might be grossly immoral to create a conscious duplicate of another person. But even in the short term, we'll have deepfakes which are not fully conscious. So I do think at some point these beings are going to have rights, as conscious beings. It's not okay just to gratuitously harm a conscious simulation, even if it's been created as a deepfake. I think we're probably going to need regulations on the creation of these deepfakes, both because of their effect on other people. They could fool people very badly, and because ultimately of the moral status of these beings themselves. I think at the very least, one thing that's very important is going to be always labeling a deepfake as a deepfake, always labeling a virtual thing as a virtual thing, always labeling, so when you're interacting with a virtual creature. In mixed realities, you're going to need to know when you're interacting with physical reality, when you're interacting with virtual reality, when it's the original and when it's a duplicate.
Yes, if I'm following this, though, if we are living in a simulation now, the simulators are creating their own simulation. So ultimately, eventually, the things we simulate will get so sophisticated that they'll create simulations, and you end up with turtles all the way down, something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll create simulations, and the people we create will create simulations. I mean, maybe at a certain point, the computer power runs out. Too many simulations within simulations. Some people have actually proposed this as a possible way to see if we're in a simulation, namely construct a high-powered simulation and
fry
really
the computer,
try and overload it, and fry the computers in the next universe up. See if we get some glitches in our simulation as a result.
You become pixelated.
If they have infinite resources, maybe they won't. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what could be happening to us right now. If they have infinite resources, maybe all bets are off. They'll handle it. But if they have only finite resources, on the other hand, people say we should be careful about this. If we ruin the simulation, maybe we'll no longer be useful to them, and they'll turn the simulation off. So there's reason for caution here.
Well, we are moving in that direction. I like that discussion of we've reached peak stuff because we're digitizing everything. Like, I used to have, yards of albums, record albums, and then much smaller amounts of CDs, cassette tapes than CDs. And now, all my music's in this little box. And so I don't have as much stuff. Well, you can just keep going like that, where we just have less stuff as it's digitized.
But VR gives you a way to go in there, and suddenly it's as big as ever. You can now interact. You can now have a world around you. Your hometown is now digitized. But okay, we'll go back in there and you'll experience it the same as ever. You'll experience a concert video of your favorite band, and you can be there in the middle of it. It's like in the Doctor Who, they say the TARDIS is bigger on the inside. And you go into a VR headset, and these tiny little digital creatures suddenly explode into massive reality. It's bigger on the inside too. So, yeah.
I know
digital
Ray
reality.
Kurzweil. I don't know if you ever saw the documentary based on Ray's life. I think it was called Transcendent Man. I think it was called. And he's famously keeping stuff about his dad, his father, in the basement. Everything he can get about him. His father was a composer, for example, so he has all his musical compositions and stuff about his personal life and his voice and so on, with this idea at some point, maybe I can resurrect my father. Now, there's a kind of an interesting Freudian thing there, or whatever it is, because, his father died at, I think, age 51, and something of a workaholic, I guess, and, Ray feels like he didn't know his dad that well, so in a way, he's kind of trying to do everything you're talking about here. At some point, if you have enough information, you could reconstruct somebody that you're close to that you want to reconnect with. But I just thought that was such a mind-blowing idea. Seems like we're a long ways from that. Probably not in our lifetime, although he thinks singularity's coming soon.
Well, yes and no. People have been doing things a little bit like this already. I don't know if you heard about the guy last year who brought his girlfriend back to life with GPT-3. That is, he took all their text messages and fed them into GPT-3, and then he would text with GPT-3, and it was kind of a little bit like, he said, it was a little bit like texting with his girlfriend, and apparently it was therapeutic for him. And in the end, he stopped. I mean, okay, no one thinks this really was reanimating his girlfriend. There wasn't a conscious system here, but I guess that's what Ray Kurzweil wants to move towards. If just say we had not just, say, the records of text messaging, but some brain scans, maybe a frozen brain, that's, I guess, the whole cryonics angle, a whole bunch of video recordings. Hey, I hope, maybe whoever the simulators are, that's all the AIs of the future, I hope they keep a record of this conversation. So they got a bit more data on you and me to reanimate from enough of that information, who's to say they won't be able to reverse engineer a pretty good version or reconstruct it? We couldn't do that, but the AGI of the future is going to be, the artificial general intelligence will be a lot smarter than us. Maybe it'll be able to come up with the best reconstruction that fits all the data, and that will be not very different from the original. So yeah, we call that reconstructive uploading, uploading yourself by reconstruction. Who's to say they might not be able to reconstruct a whole lot of people? Wasn't that Tipler's omega point, that everyone gets reconstructed eventually in the omega point?
Yes, not only everyone who lived, but everyone who could have lived. So, trillions of people, but it doesn't matter because it only matters that you're the one, through your eyeball, your point of view, feels like you're reconstructed. There could be a whole bunch of David Chalmers that are slightly different from you, but it doesn't matter.
I see. This is not even reconstruction, right? It's just like random combinatorial production of all of these beings, and one of them happens to be like you. It wasn't based on you. It just turns out to be just like you. I get it.
Yeah.
Reconstruction may be somewhat more efficient than recreating every possible being.
So, David, I kind of joked, it's turtles all the way down, simulation all the way down by this argument. But doesn't that imply that there had to be some analog, some physical creatures that started the first simulation?
I'm inclined to think that, yeah. I'm inclined to think there has to be a base reality, unsimulated, that then ran a simulation, and then, yeah, you can then raise the question, where are we in this hierarchy? And actually, I always you remember in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they program a computer for to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, and then it comes up with the answer, 42. And then it's like, damn, what was the question? And they had to find a question which is important enough that this could be the right answer. So I kind of like the idea that the question was, at what level of the simulation are we? And the answer is, we're at level 42. This base reality made a simulation, and there we are, 42 levels down. But actually, I do discuss in the book the idea that there needn't be a base reality. Some philosophers have argued that there doesn't have to be a fundamental level in physics. We first thought atoms were fundamental, and we think quarks are fundamental, and we think grand unified theory is fundamental. Some people think maybe it'll just keep going down. It'll keep going down. If that's true, if there's no fundamental level, maybe it's going to be the same with simulations. It just is the old story of the world being on the back of the turtle, on the back of a turtle. There's no bottom turtle. Turtle's all the way down. Maybe you can make sense of the idea. There's no bottom simulation. It's just simulations all the way up. I don't know. That's coherent. It's kind of weird. It feels weird and ungrounded to me, but I'm not sure it's inconsistent. So maybe it's a possibility.
So most theists in the West define God as an omniscient, omnipotent being, and often omnibenevolent. But just set that last one aside to say, so if you're able to create a sim like this, and you have that kind of computing power, would that not make you essentially relatively omniscient and omnipotent? You would be God. That would be a definition of God.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I just read a nice book by a video game maker who talks about every time you make a video game, you're kind of like the god of that video game. You're setting up the parameters, you're setting up the world, you have full access to what's going on. You can control everything. So it's like you're all powerful, you're all knowing, you're the creator. So those are some of the properties of a god. There's these episodes of Rick and Morty where Rick, the eccentric scientist, creates these worlds, and they treat him like a god. But I don't know. Gods are also supposed to have other properties, right? Like being all good, benevolent, being all wise, being beings you should worship. And I guess I don't think that the simulator god has those properties. No particular reason to think the simulator is especially good or especially wise. Certainly no reason to think we should worship them or set up a religion around them. But that said, some of the issues that come up for a god do come up for a simulator. Like, why is there evil in the world? People say, how is it that a benevolent, good God allowed for there to be all this, allowed for there to be the Holocaust, allowed for there to be all these natural disasters? And that question comes up for a simulator too. Should simulators be allowed to create worlds like this? Is it an evil thing to do to create a simulation with all this evil? Is it just that the simulators don't care about it? Should we be regulating the simulators so they're not able to do monstrous things like create civilizations and then destroy them? I mean, yeah, a lot of the same issues will actually come up. I was never much of one for theology, but suddenly a bunch of the questions of theology become a little bit more practical and through the lens of a simulation.
Right. Well, maybe the answer is the sim is a lot more interesting when you have good and evil and things can happen. And as opposed to, the idea of heaven, which sounds incredibly boring. Christopher Hitchens famously described the Christian heaven as a celestial North Korea. You have this dictator that knows everything you're doing and thinking and controls everything you do. Or it would just be super boring because there's nothing to do but just worship the deity and feel all intense love all of the time. Like, bleh, that doesn't sound good to me.
There's got to be a better heaven than that. I don't know. Maybe if the simulators, the simulation might give us a route to life after death too. Maybe when we die, the simulators pluck us, or at least some of us, pluck our code out of the simulation and put us down in some other virtual world. And I don't know, maybe this virtual world could be the really cool virtual world where they tell us about all the scientific discoveries and the nature of our world that we wanted to know all about, and then sets us on new quests with new mysteries to solve. I don't know. I hope heaven isn't. Wasn't it the Talking Heads song that said heaven is a place where nothing ever really happens? I hope stuff gets to happen in heaven. Otherwise, I don't want to be there.
No, me neither. And maybe that's the answer to the problem of evil. And did Hitler get away with it if there's no God or afterlife? Well, maybe the simulator doesn't bring Hitler back, and that the afterlife is like the original Jewish version of the afterlife is you don't go anywhere, you just don't exist anymore. That's your punishment. And so maybe the simulators just go, okay, you, Mr. Chalmers, were a good guy, so we're going to bring you back in the next round of the simulation. But Hitler, no, you don't get to exist again.
Well, you know what would be really pathological? They say we will upload you if and only if you believe in us, the simulators. If you believe that we exist, the simulator, then we will upload you to heaven. If not, you will suffer in the hell simulation for all of eternity. No, that would be really pathological.
That sounds uncomfortably familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, why does the deity...
I got into some of this...
Yeah, go ahead.
I got into some of this stuff from watching my 5-year-old nephew at work on a sim game. He showed me how it worked in the SimCity game. Like, I build this, I build a town, I build a hospital, build a forest, get the people, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, now's the fun part. And then he rained down death and destruction, fire and hurricanes, and destroyed everything. I thought, okay, that gave me a real insight into the Old Testament God.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, that's the problem of evil explained. It's just a more interesting world.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually one of the theists' arguments against the secular problem of evil refutes the God hypothesis, is that you can't have good and morality without evil and immorality. That you have to have both.
Do you have to have a lot of it though? I mean, you think a little bit of evil would go a long way.
Yeah.
Do we really need
that's
the Holocaust?
right. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Do we really need a Holocaust? Right. I know, because the argument that, well, it makes you a stronger person and you develop more character when you suffer. Yeah, okay, but how about just like the equivalent of a workout suffering? I'm a little
Yeah.
stronger the next day because I worked out today. Why does it have to be, genocide and all these, horrific things that happen to people?
I guess the alternative is they create every universe that has a net balance of good over evil, just because that's improved things slightly overall. So as long as you make the case that even in this world, yeah, okay, the Holocaust was terrible, but there was just enough good things that somehow that makes up for it. I don't know. Some people would take the view that even creating a world with all this evil would be morally monstrous, even if it's outweighed by good. But I don't know, if God's a utilitarian, maybe it's like you do the calculations and you add up the good and the evil, and you create the world if it's a net positive.
Yeah, well, theists do try to do that in a utilitarian way. The argument God works in mysterious ways. And I know it looks bad now, but he's got this plan. And in the long run, this is good for you. Oh, okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be the sim knows what you don't know, the simulator. So, all right, David, we've been going over an hour and a half. Let's move to a quick lightning round, because one of the things I loved about your book is all the major questions in philosophy that you deal with through the simulation hypothesis, which is great. So I assume you're an atheist. I haven't actually looked it up, but I assume you are. But would you not then say something like the simulator would be the closest we could think of as there being a God?
I'd say I'm on board. It's as close as I've come to believing there's a God, is taking seriously the idea that there's a simulator. It's a naturalistic version of God. I never liked believing in God, partly because it seemed supernatural. But now I can actually see potentially naturalistic, scientifically understandable process by which creating a computer simulation is not that remarkable. You can see how that would work. So that gets you partway to being to a God. However, I still refuse to worship the simulator. I don't think the simulator is worthy of worship. But I guess to me, it feels like it's so central to the traditional idea of a God that it be a being who's worthy of worship that I'm still not really prepared to call her. I don't believe in any being who's worthy of worship. And so I guess I think this, even if there is a simulator, it doesn't really deserve the name God for me. So I still, even if I came to believe there is a simulator who created the world, I would still refuse to worship the simulator and call myself an atheist.
But maybe you'd show some gratitude, like, thanks for bringing me back. I appreciate that. But now I'm going to live my life.
I'd be full of respect and awe for that simulator for doing this. It's like, yeah, that's an amazing achievement. Well, maybe it was just a hacker who pressed a button on Sim Universe on their iPhone. Who's to say?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, what about moral values? Are there any objective moral values in the simulation or in our world?
I go back and forth on this one. I guess I think all value ultimately comes from consciousness. But I do think consciousness carries maybe some objective value. Maybe pain is objectively bad, and pleasure is objectively good. Maybe that's some objective value, but I also think a lot of value comes from our acts of valuing what we value. If I value something as a conscious creature, that makes it valuable for me, and ultimately that's the deepest kind. That's among the deepest kinds of value there is. So I think some value is objective, but some value may be subjective. Either way, all value is going to be rooted in our nature as conscious beings.
Mm-hmm. Therefore, they really exist somewhere. I mean, it's dependent on human nature being a certain way. How you treat other people very much depends on what our nature is of how we should act when we interact with others. And that has a kind of objectivity to it. I think it does anyway. And we discover that by studying humans.
Yeah, I think pain is bad. Causing pain in other people is objectively to, at the very least, to do something which is bad for them. And whether morality is objective is kind of a further question on whether value at the individual level is objective. And I go back and forth on that. But I think at the very least that you cause something bad to happen, that could be an objective truth. And that it was bad to do that, I don't know. I go back and forth on morality. I find that one confusing. But I've certainly got utilitarian days when it seems to me that, yeah, if you make something good happen, that's a good thing to do. If you make something bad happen, that's a bad thing to do.
Let me read you two passages, one from one of my books, one from Pinker's book, on our argument for there being something like objective universal morality. So Here's what I wrote. It is my hypothesis that in the same way Galileo and Newton discovered physical laws and principles about the natural world that really are out there, so too have social scientists discovered moral laws and principles about human nature and society that really do exist. Just as it was inevitable that the astronomer Johannes Kepler would discover that planets have elliptical orbits, given that he was making accurate astronomical measurements and given that planets really do travel in elliptical orbits, he could hardly have discovered anything else. Scientists studying political, economic, social, and moral subjects will discover certain things that are true in these fields of inquiry. For example, democracies are better than autocracies. Market economies are superior to command economies. Torture and the death penalty do not curb crime. Burning women as witches is a fallacious idea. That women are not too weak and emotional to run companies or countries. And most poignantly, that blacks do not like being enslaved and that Jews do not want to be exterminated. Close quote. So here's how Pinker thinks of this. It's almost like discovering abstract Platonic truths. On this analogy, he writes, we are born with a rudimentary concept of number, but as soon as we build on it with formal mathematical reasoning, the nature of mathematical reality forces us to discover some truths and not others. No one who understands the concept of 2, the concept of 4, and the concept of addition can come to any conclusion but that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Perhaps we're born with a rudimentary moral sense, and as soon as we build on it with moral reasoning, the nature of moral reality forces us to some conclusions, but not others. And then his example is, if I appeal to you to do anything that affects me, to get off my foot or tell me the time or not run me over with your car, then I can't do it in a way that privileges my interests over yours, say retaining my right to run you over with my car if I want you to take me seriously. Unless I'm a galactic overlord, and I guess in this example, your simulator, I have to state my case in a way that would force me to treat you in kind. I can't act as if my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, any more than I can persuade you that the spot I'm standing on is a special place in the universe just because I happen to be standing on it. So, your thoughts on that?
Oh boy, okay, that's a big one.
That's a lot, yeah.
Morality, yeah. Morality, I find confusing. I love the project of trying to derive morality from universal principles. Like, yeah, we've got to be able to universalize everything. Got to make sense from every perspective, and then morality is what's invariant over that. I'm more comfortable with value, individual value, being an objective matter. I do think consciousness puts value into the world. I mean, once you've got value, morality is not that far away. Yeah, the idea of maximizing value as, to act morally is to maximize value, or at least to increase value. Of course, there are so many different ways of maximizing value. We won't always give you a determinate result. I worry, especially in infinite universes, boy, where every action has an infinite number of consequences. There may be no way to actually compare our actions to each other. Everything will be good in some ways and bad in some ways. So you do get into a lot of philosophical paradoxes once you try and reduce morality to value, even for a utilitarian. If you're not a utilitarian, it gets more complex still. But I'm open to the project, let's say, to finding some objective story about how morality is constituted by value. But I'm also open to the idea that it's very deeply a product of our human evolutionary psychology, and what we call morality is basically, what we've evolved to respect and to govern our lives.
Right, and in your section on how society should be organized, would a simulator run the simulation in a way that democracy would probably end up being a better system than autocracies, and giving people's rights, and having a kind of a regulated market economy, sort of a Northern European kind of social structure, political economic system? And if so, would that imply that those really are better? They really do evolve that way because they really do work better, or something like that, in an objective sense?
I don't know. I guess I can imagine the simulator might be a social scientist that's wanting to run a whole lot of experiments with different political systems, and
see what happens.
Let's see how this one goes. Let's see how this one goes. I mean, we've experimented with a fair number in the history of the Earth already, but so many factors have always been mixed in together. It hasn't been a really good experiment. But once we had
Mm.
adequate simulation technology, you could just vary all the parameters on markets and on democracy and on different forms of representation and redistribution and everything else. See which ones actually end up working and which ones don't. It seems like that's. I mean, if you're going to perform simulation experiments like this, that's actually a pretty good use for it. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's monstrous because it's going to make a whole lot of people in these simulations suffer. But if it's all to a good end of finding out what social structures actually lead to good outcomes, maybe they could justify it to an institutional review board.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I liked your point in the book about we are using simulations like this for the weather. You want to model the climate, or you want to model the weather, say 10 days out. That's what these computer simulations do. Or you want to model climate for the next century. That's what these computer models do. Those are a kind of simulation. So scale that up for what you just said. I could see actually that being a really useful thing to do. Like, let's run 10,000 societies for a century and try every configuration of political systems, economic systems, and see what happens. Whatever your metric is going to be, the longevity or health or happiness of the citizens or whatever the metric is.
Yeah, there's a Black Mirror episode where when a couple meets each other at a bar and they're considering whether to go out on a date, then they run like 100 or 1,000 relationship simulations to see how it goes,
see how it works,
see if they're going to be compatible or not, and if that goes okay, then maybe they'll actually go on a date and start a relationship. Actually, I've got one objection to this kind of use of simulation technology for predictive purposes, especially in the social sciences, which is, are the people we're simulating, do they use simulation technology too? So when we simulate these people going out on dates, do we simulate two people who have access to simulation technology? If they do, then boy, you're going to have this big recursive problem. They're all going to be running the simulation app. We'll have simulations within simulations, and maybe nothing will ever get finished. But if we don't simulate the simulation technology, then we're just going to be simulating a totally different scenario of how our relationship would go in a world of no simulation technology, which is very different, of course, from what may be their actual scenario. So I think this could actually be some kind of principled limitation of the use of simulations for predictive purposes, especially in a social context where the use of simulation technology may really make a difference.
But as I understand these dating sites, which have kind of come online after I was married, so I don't really have personal experiences with them, but I know that they use a lot of algorithms, and you take personality tests, and they try to match people that are, that we think because of past experience and algorithms are going to be a good match because they're both high in openness to experience, or they're both this type of personality, or they have these interests. In a way, they're kind of trying to model what could happen to save each person a lot of time. Where dating, you used to have to just date for 6 months to figure out, is this person somebody I want to marry or not? But now you could do it, in a 5-minute date after a big data crunch through the dating site that does this for you.
Yeah, I mean, yes, these algorithms are not yet running full-scale simulations, but they are trying to at least abstract out certain features of your personality that may govern compatibility. And like you, I've never really used these sites, but yeah, I mean, obviously they work for a lot of people. The question arises as to whether the algorithms they're using are based on, for example, some past era. Maybe initially use a model of personality produced around 2000 for doing this stuff in 2010. Is that going to work anymore in this new technological context? Now, I think, as a matter of fact, from what I've read, people who run these dating sites are constantly updating their algorithms to, in light of feedback about the results they're getting. So maybe there's less of this problem of a lag. But once they start running full-scale simulations, the question will arise: do we actually simulate the role of our dating site itself in the relationship?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. The sim is going to depend very, very much depend on the accuracy of the information you input for the algorithm. Because what if it's not true that open-minded people like other open-minded people? Maybe they like, or shy people like shy people. Maybe they don't. Maybe they like extroverts, and maybe extroverts like introverts. So there's no conflict, and whatever that turns out to be.
I hear these dating sites are an imperfect art. You got to, what is it? Kiss a lot of frogs before you find your
Yes.
prince, your
Right.
princess.
All right, David, last question here. Big question on what's the meaning and purpose of life, or how do you live a good life in the context of your sim models?
Oh boy, I don't think I've got a simple answer to what's the meaning or purpose of life. I think, meaning in life, I think, is where we find it. We're conscious creatures, and we have this ability to invest our world with meaning. I mean, a world of atoms, a physical world may look kind of meaningless, but we come into this universe as conscious creatures, and we find things meaningful. Where things that are valuable to us, things that give us pleasure, and things that projects with outcomes that we want to achieve as conscious beings. I think of that as investing the world with meaning, and I think we can do the same in a digital world. This is why ultimately I think that digital worlds are potentially as meaningful as physical worlds. Bits aren't intrinsically meaningful, but nor are atoms. But we come into these worlds as conscious creatures, and we can invest things with meaning. There'll be things that give us value. There'll be goals that we can set and we can attain. And I think, so the source and the locus of our meaning in the world is consciousness, and consciousness can play that role equally in a physical world or a digital world.
Nice. Perfect place to end the conversation. David, thank you for your work. Thanks for the new book, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. I love the book and all your previous work. What's next on your writing, research, thinking plate?
Oh, don't I get to take a couple of years off?
A 500-page book.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did 5 years writing this book. I think I'm going to relax for a little while, but
that's a good idea. I like that.
What comes next, but go to the beach first.
Yes, that sounds a real analog beach.
For sure.
All righty. Yeah, thanks for coming on, David.